All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Well, thank you for the invitation, I should say, to speak. Yeah, so we'll talk about what I'm about to talk about today in a second, but I want to introduce with a little video clip. But before I do, hi, my name is Liz Ryerson. I use she, her pronouns. I've taught at the Game Center intro to game design a couple of times, and then this semester I'm teaching intermediate game design. Yeah, I've known Maddie for a while. I've been involved kind of more in the like artsy game space, but I've also like kind of grew up going on online forums about games, and that kind of has relevance to what we're about to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're just going to give a little video clip here.
第1回目はこちら、アトランティスの謎。これは全部で100面あるやつかな。100面クリアするまで、返しません。みんなをね。
今回挑戦するのは86年にサンソフトから発売されたアトランティスの謎。アクションゲームの常識をはるかに超えた全100ステージ構成。一筋縄ではいかない数々のトラップ。エンディングまでの道のりは長い。
この挑戦コーナー、なんと本腰を入れて、業界でいうところの尺が伸びました。だからギブアップはしません。
ギブアップはしないと高らかに宣言し、プレイ開始。
やってたなぁ。スキンチってやってたんかな。よし、やろう。わ、7機しかないんや。これ確かワンナップとかなかったな。何や。うわ、うんこや。ものすごいうんこ。ものすごいうんこしてるな、こいつ。これジャンプしてる間にバックとかできへんねんな。うわ、進みにくいな。
操作性の難しさもこのゲームの特色。兄の記憶を頼りにプレイするが、
あれあ、カラスに当たったんか。解かなあかんのかな。
感覚をつかめないままなんとか1面、そして2面をクリア。順調に思えたのだが、
危ない。あー、落ちた。あ、あかん、はまってきたな、変なとこに。
少し難しくなった3面にはまり続け、あえなくゲームオーバー。
早いな。これで100面ずっといくの？ちょっと見てみて。
説明書を見て打開策を探す有野。
半人前の青年冒険家なんや。一人前用意せよな。あ、これ前に持ってた人のやつですかね。記録がこの16面で終わりましたね。16面でやめてるやん。
2面から3面に行く扉を通り過ぎ、先へと進む有野。そして奥で見つけた別の扉に入る。すると、
あ、9面いった。そういうことか。
一挙9面へワープ。このワープこそがアトランティスの謎攻略の鍵となる。
あとだ。
アイテムを取り次へと進む。しかし、
うわ、戻った。8面になったやん。
ワープは先に進むとは限らない。そしてこの8面も一筋縄ではいかなかった。
Okay, I'm going to stop there. But that's a clip from the Japanese game, the Japanese show Game Center CX, starring Arino, who is a comedian. He plays through a lot of challenging games, but that game is obviously it's called Atlantis no Nazo, or otherwise known as the Mystery of Atlantis. Okay, let's begin here. Oh, I'm gonna. No, that's fine. Okay. So yeah, we're going to talk about something interesting that probably most of you haven't heard of, and it's the genre of kusoge, which is, I'll explain it in a minute, but the title of this lecture is On Kusoge, Why Shit Has Value. And these are a couple screenshots of games that I'll mention at least. So yeah, what is a kusoge? So kusoge is derived from the Japanese word kuso, meaning crap or shit, so literally meaning shit, and game. And it's basically just a way of saying like this is a bad game. But over time, there have become kind of like a subculture around these games that developed for people who love playing these kinds of games and who embrace them or who just find them entertaining. The term is thought to be coined by Jun Miura, who is a writer for the Japanese video game magazine Famitsu, which is like their most well-known game magazine in Japan. And kuso in general is just become a internet term for campy, crappy, outrageously bad media. Here's a couple examples that I have like cover art of. This game is called Hong Kong 97, a very strange game, which I do not have time to talk about. But you can just kind of get a good sense of what you're in for by looking at the cover of this. And the same token, our friends here with Snow White and the Seven Clever Boys, this is a real game. This is not a meme or anything. And yeah, these were both games that were commercially released and sold on store shelves. So I think that's part of the entertainment value of this, is just the idea that people were selling this stuff. Yeah. So as a little tangent, I want to kind of make the point of comparison. I don't know if some of you might have heard of who is often considered to be the most famous bad, quote unquote, I put bad in quotes, and I will put it in quotes the entire lecture, film director Ed Wood. So Ed Wood was a director of low budget films in the 50s in LA. Many of his films contained like glaring technical errors. They had really bizarre, campy aesthetics. There were just lots of strange and baffling choices made. And many of his films employed people who were kind of on the margins of Hollywood. These were very low budget kind of exploitation films. There's one called Glenn or Glenda, which is about, I actually think it's about transitioning, one of the early films about, no, or it might be about being a cross-dresser, I'm not sure. Surprisingly progressive in some ways. But his most famous film is Plan 9 from Outer Space, which so Ed Wood died in obscurity. He was an alcoholic. After a certain point, his sort of band of outsiders broke up, and kind of interest in these kind of ephemeral media that were produced, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, this kind of backwash of Hollywood, these people who are kind of like lost and forgotten. More and more people got kind of interested in this trash media. So there was a book called, I think it was called the Golden Turkey Awards, and that was released in 1980, and it called Plan 9 from Outer Space the worst movie of all time. It officially dubbed it the worst movie of all time. But because of that, his films gradually developed a large cult following, to the point where there's a movie by Tim Burton called Ed Wood, starring Johnny Depp. He just kind of has developed a cult following of fans who really embraces all of his films' idiosyncrasies and technical shortcomings, because there's something interesting about them. There's something that you don't see elsewhere in other works in them. And that's really kind of what we're talking about today, but just for video games. So yeah, kusoge, or crappy, shitty games come from a similar context. You see here our friend James, the video game nerd, which we'll talk about in a second, a YouTuber who's been around a very long time, since the mid 2000s, who reviews or does videos about bad games. But a lot of these games were often made during times when rules and best practices weren't really established on how to approach game design. Sometimes the games were like ubiquitous enough or mass produced enough to exist on store shelves, where hapless children, where parents of hapless children might buy them, not knowing what they were getting into. There's a famous shitty, crappy game called Superman 64, which I don't talk about. I'm not talking about so much in this lecture, but I had a friend whose mom, I think, literally asked a store clerk, what game should I buy? Should I buy my son for Christmas? And the store clerk, perhaps knowing that this game was bad, suggested that she buy Superman 64 for full price. And he was not pleased about that. But anyway, yeah, a lot of these games become popular through game reviewers, YouTubers, or earlier forms of that, online forums, magazines, especially back in the 90s, 80s and 90s. And like a lot of Ed Wood's films, a lot of them have heart, or they have some kind of interesting appeal to them. It's not always true, though. I mean, here we see a clip from a magazine review that I clipped of Superman 64. It says 4 reasons to hate Superman. And yeah, it just basically showing kind of the a janky, low effort that went into making this licensed game. You can see they gave it 14% and called it an utterly hopeless, consistently appalling leper of a game, bordering on the illegal. Okay. So yeah. So, okay, so these are not official kind of ways to break down kusoge, but I've kind of created a list of different sort of a way to kind of explain the different kind of contexts and different kind of places that games come from and where they vaguely fit into it. What makes a bad game, I guess, is another way to think about it. And remember that, like, we're talking about a lot of games that were produced and sold on commercial store shelves, although there's certainly bad games that people have embraced that are more recent, but this is where kind of the subculture comes from. So some of this is just a result of very rushed development time or developers with limited resources. Big example of that is the game E.T., which we will talk about shortly. Perhaps it's a completely cynical and calculated cash-in, like the example, the Superman 64 game, or Big Rigs, which I will talk about shortly. Maybe it's a first-time or inexperienced developer who didn't know what they were doing. I'll talk about Death Crimson. This other game is called Stargazer. It's an infamous RPG for the Famicom. A lot of these games didn't make it out of Japan, actually. A lot of the Japanese games I'm talking about. Or maybe they just have kind of experimental or outdated game design ideas that maybe aren't fully executed on, or maybe they're just misunderstood. So maybe it's not the greatest game, but there's something really interesting there, and maybe it's just misunderstood. Or it could be an intentionally hostile game design deliberately meant to antagonize the player. We'll talk about Tageshi's Challenge. That's one of the most famous examples of this kind of game. Or it could just be cult classic games, which could, fit any category, really. Plenty of cult classic games are not even necessarily bad, or they're debatably bad. They may only be considered kusoge to some. I put Deadly Premonition, which some of you might have heard of, on there. God Hand's another example. Those are games that are generally considered to be good, but may have elements that are, that meant that they were received poorly, or, some interesting kind of components to them that make them unique or strange. Okay, so speaking of E.T., you probably heard this history. It's almost like kind of a cliche. In 1983, Atari was kind of a game company that was kind of dominating the landscape of console games, specifically in the US. And they were producing tons and tons of like the Atari 2600 game consoles, and also arcade games, both in Japan and elsewhere in the US, started to become big, and Atari were obviously involved in making those as well. But they kind of began to cut corners, not really respecting developers, and they went under new leadership. Nolan Bushnell, who started the company, left, and this guy Ray Kassar took over, and he was just basically like trying to get them to pump out games like as fast as possible. So this led to a huge boom, which meant that they just produced tons of these games that were all kind of samey, because you couldn't do a lot with Atari 2600 games, and they weren't giving, enough development time. And they really pumped the stock of this up, which led to this video game crash that happened in the console market, especially here in the US and elsewhere, from about 1983 to 1985. This didn't really happen necessarily with PC gaming as much, which did exist around the time, Apple II, C64, etc. But one game that's kind of scapegoated for this is this game called E.T., which was a licensed game. It became sort of well known as the kind of the worst game of all time on the internet for a long time. Which leads us to talking about number one, rush development time or limited resources. E.T. was made in 5 weeks by one person, Howard Scott Warshaw, whose previous game, Raiders of the Lost Ark, was made in 9 months. This came out partially out of, I think, crunch to produce in time for like a holiday, holiday crunch, because it was the big new movie, and also out of Atari's disregard for its employees. This is a quote from this story of an interview with this guy. He said that he saw more nervous breakdowns in the Atari offices than any place he had ever worked. Something he said was common in software development. Literally, you'd see vans pulling up to take people away from Atari who'd kind of lost it, he said. I just find that fascinating. But a lot of those development time and crunch on developers, a lot of those issues continue to today, unfortunately. But yeah, E.T.'s failure was endemic to working conditions at Atari. Howard Scott Warshaw himself says it was certainly not the sole factor that played into Atari. It was a byproduct of philosophies. In 1983, they posted 310 million losses. Their CEO was sued for insider trading, and supposedly they buried a huge truckload of games in this landfill in Alamogordo, Mexico. And this was thought to be like an urban legend for years until the game was actually dug up. I have a clip of that. I might link it later because I want to continue to move on with this lecture. But here, I'll just show you a little clip of E.T.'s gameplay here on this window. So yeah, the environment of this game is confusingly abstract. The controls for jumping in and out of these pits is kind of weird. It's hard to get a hang of. The game also has a time limit, which it doesn't necessarily tell you about. This is a description from the speedrunner who is speedrunning this game. It says the goal of the game is to find 3 phone pieces that are found in random pits, so it's random. Once you find all 3 pieces, you must find a random tile on the map that allows you to call home. This starts a 30-second countdown until your ship lands. You must be standing on a specific tile as the 30 seconds are up in order to beat the game. A scientist, who is the guy who's carrying E.T. right now, tries to take you back to the lab, and the FBI agents, who are the guys in yellow, tries to take your phone pieces. If one of those guys are on the screen, the ship won't land. So that's basically a description of the gameplay. The gameplay does not contextualize this at all. This is partly due to just Atari's limitations. But yeah, a lot of people bought this game and were completely confused by it. You can see our speedrunner friend beating it just fine, but yeah. All right. So was E.T. actually that bad? I mean, the speedrunner himself in those comments said, I actually like this game, by the way. And Howard Scott Warshaw, who made that game, previously made a game called Yar's Revenge, which is considered to be, by many, to be one of the best games on the system. I think it is the best-selling game made by Atari, like as a first-party game for the system. But after E.T., Warshaw was kind of scapegoated. Informed by his bad experiences, he left the game industry and became a Silicon Valley therapist, I think, as a way to deal with his own PTSD, which I think is really interesting. The reason why a lot of people know this now is he kind of became a fixture on this like classic gaming convention circuit. When they dug up the E.T. from the landfill, they interviewed him, and it's kind of like a redemption story for him. In his accounts of the development have led a lot of people to reevaluate the game and kind of consider it to be more of a misunderstood game that was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So yeah, many people now don't consider E.T. to be the worst game of all time, and it certainly wasn't the only thing that caused the video game crash. They found many Atari games in that landfill. I showed a picture previously here. Yeah, not just E.T. They dumped a bunch of games, and reasons as to why I don't know, but I guess we could speculate on that. But Yeah. So sorry, I'm gonna see if I can. We'll just do this. Okay, that's fine. So Big Rigs Over the Road Racing. It's one of the games that I kind of vaguely assigned. And this is a PC game, and I'm just going to let our friend James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, kind of describe and play through the first parts of this game. But just think about this quote from this website, Hardcore Gaming 101. It's hard not to see the bad faith behind this game. Okay.
2000 with a PC game called Big Rigs Over the Road Racing. I usually stick to consoles, and I don't usually do games from the current millennium, but this is a huge request. I've been told countless times that it's one of the worst, if not the worst game ever made, but I'm sure that's an exaggeration. It just looks like a generic, mediocre racing game with trucks. And it's from the new millennium, well after the pioneering days of gaming, after the ETs and Jekyll and Hydes, after the advent of quality control. So how bad could it be? Let's find out. Alright, let me grab the mouse here. Okay, pick the truck. Yeah, that's fine. Pick the course. Alright, loading. And the race begins. What are the complaints here? This is awesome! Look at this, look at me, look at me, go, 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 go! Oh, yeah, your truck passes through everything! I haven't found one thing that stops you. Not even the hills slow you down. This is one hell of a truck. It's invincible. How could you not love a game where there's no rules? I'm not even trying to play the race. I'm just trying to find as many things to drive through as possible. You're a ghost trucker. Are you Large Marge? The only thing I can sort of hit is a downed helicopter. Up we go again. Big Rigs Over the Road Racing. Over the road is right. It's my way or the highway, and the highway ain't got shit.
All right. All right. Yeah, that's Big Rigs. That's Big Rigs Over the Road Racing. But yeah, this game holds the worst Metacritic rating of all time. I looked it up, and this game was developed by. I actually have the Wikipedia article here. It's developed. I know Wikipedia is not always a reliable source, but whatever. Stellar Stone was the developer of the game, but they outsourced the development to Ukraine. And I'm going to imagine that perhaps I'm going to attribute the bad faith to the publisher for even publishing this game, because who knows how much time they gave to the developer to actually work on this. But yeah, in spite of all the basic just 101 issues with this game, it was actually sold on store shelves, which is amazing to me. Okay. Yeah, so as you saw, obstacles that would normally hinder you are just things you can phase through. Opposing racers will just sit there and never move. You can always win. And when you win, you get this screen that says, "Your winner." And there's a 3-handled trophy. This game kind of even challenges the basic idea of what a game is, completely unintentionally, but it's almost cathartic to watch. Like, all these things that would normally kind of hinder you in a normal game are just not, they just don't even exist. You just drive all the way through them. But just the lack of basic effort that went into making the game, sort of combined with the fact that it actually sold on store shelves, like he had a physical copy there, it just makes it entertaining to think about. It also makes it great fodder for YouTubers or personalities like James Rolfe, who really popularized playing these kinds of games and kind of, yeah, popularized kind of the legacy of kind of these games as being bad or shitty games or whatever. But yeah, if this game were like somebody's Unity engine demo or like a work in progress or something, you probably wouldn't think much of it. You maybe think like, oh, this is a little off. You know, you obviously need to work on this a lot more. Why did you put all those things into the environment, you know, that when you have no collision? But yeah, it's the context that is really important here and is why it's kind of so funny that this game exists. But yeah, let's move on. Let's talk about this game called Death Crimson. I'll go to my notes in a second, actually. Let's go back to full screen mode. Not what I wanted. Okay, so Death Crimson was a my goodness. So Death Crimson was a light gun game, a shooting game for the Sega Saturn. Again, only released in Japan, probably reason for that they didn't port it. Released in 1996 by Ecole Software. This is their like logo, which I find very bizarre. Let me go back before I. And it was notable sort of for extremely poor scores in Japanese game magazines. And this was mostly due to very strange and confusing presentation style. It's very difficult shooting mechanics that are not really functional at all. It's like hard to know exactly how to hit the enemies and they just pop up from nowhere. There's not a lot of feedback or spatial signposts or clues, you know, that are usually required to you as part of just basic 101 design for on-rail shooters. This quote from this article that I'm about to read from says, Death Crimson somehow manages the dual feat of both failing to clear some of the lowest bars imaginable, as well as serving as an entirely unique and absolutely unforgettable experience. If that isn't like a perfect encapsulation of what like kusoge are, then I don't know what is. Okay, so here's some clips from the game. I'm going to read from this article, which is from the website called badgamehalloffame.com, which is a great source for stuff like this. So while you're watching this clip, just think about that. Okay, this clip said, let me turn the volume down a little bit. We talked before about how the term kusoge on this website and how Japan's perspective on bad games can often differ from ours here in the States. To sum it succinctly, our tendency in America when faced with a piece of lackluster software is to launch into performatively angry tirades where we can curse their names and urge the rest of the world not to waste their precious time on them. When presented with a perceived failure along the lines of E.T., we're quick to condemn it as trash and promptly discard it. As a stark contrast, Japan's gaming community can sometimes embrace these bad games with open arms, finding ways to appreciate these releases in the face of their flaws, or even for their flaws, as the case may be. Flying in the face of American sentiment, the stink of a shit game may actually serve as alluring and in search for players in search of a charmingly wretched and challengingly busted title. In some rare instances, this morbid curiosity can even correlate with increased sales, making successes of games that would otherwise sink studios here in the West. Such was the case with Death Crimson. By the way, I just love the music for this game. I'm gonna continue to watch it. Following Death Crimson's reception in Japanese, it was reviewed extremely poorly. Demand began to swell around this game, and it eventually led to it selling quite a few copies for the amount of budget. And it was enough to result in profit and basically keep this company in business and make it into their sort of flagship franchise. So in a way, like its reputation of being this notoriously bad game kind of saved this game and this game company, because there's something about it that it just has heart. It just feels like unlike anything else. There's just something about it that it just feels like a unique and singular experience. But yeah, speaking of a singular experience, we have The Mystery of Atlantis, which you saw clips from before. It was a game released in 1986 for the Famicom by Sunsoft, who was actually a company who made a lot of well-known, well-regarded Famicom NES games like Blaster Master and the Batman port, the Batman game for the NES. This game has 100 stages, and it has to be progressed through using your bombs. That's your only option, your only weapons in a completely non-linear fashion. So you can go forward and you go back, as you saw in the video at the beginning. You need certain items to complete the game, which can only be found by going through certain paths. And while this game is often derided for its cryptic progression, I mean, later on, the company would make a lot more well-received games. I would make the case, here's a map of what you're dealing with here, of the different kind of intersections between the stages. And you're probably like, what the heck am I looking at? But yeah, that's exactly how I feel when I look at this. But I think it's just fascinating that a game like this has a structure like this. Another famous, somebody made a map that I found on which I'm so amused by this map. Somebody like made their own handmade map of like all the intersections between the stages. It's just this challenging, bizarre maze. And just as kind of a tangent, it makes me think of a game that I'm much more familiar with, which is Wolfenstein 3D, game by id Software, early first-person shooter game for the PC. And Wolfenstein 3D had a lot of like really interesting, weird secrets in it. The biggest one is probably this one called the Aardwolf maze, which is, as you can see on the map, it's like it takes up basically half of the map, and it's this maze here that's traced out. And at the end of the maze, you'd have to press all these secret doors, and you could very easily get trapped or get stuck. And it was supposed to be really, really hard. And you were supposed to, at the end, there was a sign that said call Apogee, which is their publisher, and say Aardwolf. But the contest never really existed because people learned how to get into the game's files and like view the sprites and stuff. So I don't know if anybody actually completed it, before using an editor to see the paths. But yeah, the incredible sort of trial and error difficulty of this maze. Again, this isn't a required part of the game, but there are other parts of the game that are required that do stuff like this, although much more toned down, but still have these kind of sensibility that's fallen out of fashion, which is hiding massive secrets within secrets, little to no information how to progress, just kind of needing to use trial and error. And similarly, Atlantis No Nazo has this labyrinthine level of complexity with just dead ends and secret paths, including Zone 42, which is literally called Black Hole. You just arrive in a door and it dumps you off into a death pit, and you'll lose all your lives. It's just a complete death zone. Nothing else of this zone exists other than, and it even says here, Black Hole. Design tropes like places where you can get stuck. There's just a lack of continues, required hidden secrets. There are plenty of places where you have to suicide exit a level, which means you have to bomb yourself in a particular place in order to exit, or you have to fall down a pit instead of going into a door. This kind of stuff was often more common in the 1980s and early 90s, but is now considered bad design for just how hard it is to progress. This game takes it to more of an extreme, I would say. But another game that is kind of like this is a famous arcade game called The Tower of Druaga, which has a lot of these similar, like very arcane rules for progression through it. And the idea was that players would kind of talk to each other about what they discovered in order to like learn how to progress through these levels. But the expectations on what they expect players to do have obviously changed as the industry is involved. But it's worth noting that like this design kind of ethos was part of the theory behind Zelda, the original Zelda game, and Metroid as well. That kids would kind of talk to each other on the playground and share kind of ideas about where to progress. Like, oh, maybe you can bomb in this specific place. So there's kind of like this idea that you would kind of have a network and you'd be sharing information. And there's also this idea that you're kind of getting your value for your money, or at least the idea of that time was that you wanted to have lots of secrets because maybe this is the only game that you were allowed to play for a long time. So you're kind of just there banging your head against the wall. But yeah, I think this game is really unique in spite of its like clunky and frustrating and outdated execution, the jumping being weird, etc. It's indicative of a time where developers were still experimenting to see what worked. It's kind of results in ideas that like in a slightly different context could be really considered very innovative today, and are just not like anything else today. And the kind of the strange progression and the unusual mechanics kind of also suggested an alternate history of how to approach like the design of an open-ended game. A lot of a lot of game tropes over time become solidified in one way or another. The design of like a Metroidvania game is heavily based on Metroid and Castlevania. This game kind of came, I mean, it came out this, I think the same year as Metroid, but it kind of came before that, or at least contemporaneously to that, and it kind of got thrown away. And part of that is just it being cryptic, it being hard to play, it being not fun to a lot of people. But like its title, it really does effectively convey a feeling of mystery. And other games, it's not very common, but other games like Kid Chameleon, which is a Sega Genesis game, and Umihara Kawase, which is a really interesting experimental like platforming game for Super Famicom, would sort of borrow ideas from that game. Okay, so now we're at intentionally hostile game design. We're talking about Takeshi's Challenge, one of the most famous examples of these kinds of games. It came out for the Famicom in 1986, brought to you by Takeshi Kitano, aka Beat Takeshi, really popular Japanese entertainer. He was the host of a very internationally well-known game show called Takeshi's Castle that involved contestants kind of putting their body on the line for physical challenges in order to infiltrate a castle. If the theme of Takeshi's Castle is kind of torturing contestants, then the theme of Takeshi's Challenge is torturing players. It's an action adventure game where you play as like a Japanese salaryman in search of treasure. The challenges require just ridiculous levels of commitment from players to complete with no previous like foresight. There are many players where the player has to like places where the player has to wait like at a screen and not do anything for a very long time, or like use the Famicom microphone, which was on the controller. It's not on the NES, but on the Famicom, there was a microphone. And it's one of those games where it's really easy to get into an unwinnable state. But I just want to read from this article from this magazine called Well Played, which talks about some of the unwinnable states in this game. Some of the unwinnable states in Takeshi no Chosenjo, aka Takeshi's Challenge, is if you do not engage in specific antisocial behaviors. If you want to beat the game, you must drink until you pass out, divorce your wife, quit your job, and beat up the old man who gave you the treasure map. Other unwinnable states can occur if you don't learn how to play the shamisen, or if you don't learn how to hang glide, or if you buy an airplane ticket to the wrong destination. Of course, in each unwinnable scenario, there are absolutely no hints to guide you on the right path. It seems that Takeshi wanted people to play his video game to try every conceivable option until they got it right. And according to Tetsuo Igawa, who was a salesperson at Taito, the company that made this game, who took part of the development of the game, the developers just didn't take his input and then use it to make a playable game. They would listen to a very drunk Takeshi ramble on about what might be interesting. They'd write everything down and then implement it exactly as he described it. So he's basically the lead designer of the game. And they let a completely unqualified person who hated video games be the lead designer of this game, which is fascinating to me. The final message of this game directly insults the player. It says, "You actually bothered to finish this crappy game? Sucker, don't take it so seriously." This is from the translated version, was never released in America originally. Many adventure games of the 80s kind of expected players to do tasks that are kind of frowned upon now, and providing ways for players to fail. But Takeshi's Challenge really deliberately pushes those to just the absolute limits in order to troll players. And this game apparently sold 800,000 copies, mostly to children. I've heard stories of children calling into hint lines, like game hint lines, and just crying over this game that is designed to just waste their time. But yeah, that was the intention. That was the explicit intention behind the design of the game. Similarly, there's a game called Desert Bus, which is also a celebrity vanity project from the magician's Penn and Teller. And it's part of this game called Penn and Teller Smoke and Mirrors. The objective of this game is you're a bus driver, and you have to drive from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas, Nevada in real time at 45 miles per hour. There are no obstacles in the game, just literally the desert, but the bus constantly veers to the right, requiring you to constantly adjust it. And if you crash, you are towed back to Tucson in real time. So a full playthrough, assuming everything goes right, of this game takes 8 hours. So again, a game intentionally designed to be a troll. Great fodder for streamers and stuff, I'm sure, but yeah, not designed to be played in a normal context. So you might say, oh, intentionally hostile game design, is that sort of like Dark Souls? No, it's not. This is not what I'm talking about here. A game like Dark Souls is highly polished. It may be difficult, but it's a very refined game. That kind of game is not necessarily considered bad. Kusoge usually only become that way accidentally, or because the developers just didn't care enough to not make them that way, or they were trying to make something that went beyond just the level of what you would normally expect any reasonable person to play. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, here we're almost at the end here. So cult games. Again, cult games are really vague, just like cult films. It's a very vague category that is constantly changing as the values and expectations of the audiences are changing. They could be considered kusoge or not. Example, Deadly Premonition. I put a screenshot of that, and God Hand. Many people consider those to be great games, some of their favorite games of all time. But like, I guess like with Ed Wood, what is considered disposable trash in one era could be considered valuable art in another, or even innovative and forward thinking in the case of something like Atlantis no Nazo. It's really about embracing unconventional sensibilities, and what is often considered good game design and what is considered the canon should, I think, always be up for reevaluation from audiences. So why is all this relevant? So we're in the final stretch here. So vague quote from Walter Benjamin is presented in the documentary, Slavoj Žižek documentary, A Pervert's Guide to Ideology. It talks about, we can only really get an intuition of what history is by seeing the waste of culture. So the idea is like, we get more of an idea of something, of what culture is, by seeing the waste, seeing the disposable product. So even in the cases of something like Big Rigs, which is not there isn't really much artistic merit beyond accidental. There's something interesting that just about the development story behind these games that can be as interesting in the game itself, or it can offer a snapshot into the inner workings of the history of the game industry, and kind of go beyond the usual cliches, beyond the things that are sold to us by the industry itself, by like brand loyalty, by any of that kind of stuff. They give us an insight into the creative process, and they're often very entertaining as spectacle, as you saw with like Angry Video Game Nerd or Arena's Challenge, Game Center CX, the clips that I showed you there. So here's a closing, well, not quite closing thought. Games are about the creators and their personalities and their stories, not brands or companies. I think that is the biggest thing I want to hammer into people. It is about human beings, and it is about developers. In the case of something like ET, because we have that person's account, Howard Scott Warshaw's account, we know some of the history behind this game. In the case of a lot of these other games, we don't have the history, so we kind of have to guess, and developers can get scapegoated for making a bad game when maybe they were just in circumstances that were impossible, or they were doing something kind of interesting, or or just in their embodiments of sort of the creator idiosyncrasies and personalities. But a lot of bad games are memorable, and they're definitely more interesting than mediocrity. Here's a song that is, or a tune that is from an official Resident Evil game, a famous piece of bad game music that I want you all to hear. So yeah, this was literally in a commercial game, Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition. It was composed by this guy who has a very bizarre backstory, who was supposedly deaf, but then he faked being deaf. It's called Mamoru Samaguchi. I forget his name. I'm gonna have to like put information on that. But yeah, a really bizarre story. So again, great insight into the game industry and its inner workings. I think there's a tendency to be really overly prescriptive about what is good and bad in the world of games. I think that's kind of borrowed from the tech world and this kind of objectivist thinking, but you really can't apply that to art. Art is not objective. What is a bad game and what is a good game are not so clear, and it might be completely personal, dependent on, standards at the time. It might be just completely dependent on who you are. And even if something is pretty objectively bad, in the case of something like Big Rigs, there's still something interesting about it, something worth preserving and worth thinking about. So I think we should always challenge our ideas on what games are worthwhile and what aren't. And I'll leave you with this. I have a few other video clips here, but I'll leave you with this from the excellent YouTube channel Classics of Game. And I'll present it without context.
Ready? Fight! Ring out!
Yeah, so that is basically it. These are places to look for. I really want to give a shout out to this website, Bad Game Hall of Fame. A lot of these histories are very piecemeal and sort of fledgling, or, you know, it's information that you get from random YouTube channels that may or may not be accurate. There's a lot of misinformation about what you're expected to do in Takeshi's Challenge, for example. I have some links to stuff that I used. A couple articles that I read from the website Hardcore Gaming 101 has a kusoge tag. I also found a general list of cult video games, which some of these are debatable, but it's like good to look at just to see what kind of games are considered cult video games. I found out originally about this term from this channel called Retro Pals, which streams a lot of bizarre old games. And yeah, Classics of Game YouTube channel is a classic YouTube channel which presents very weird and strange moments from games completely out of context. So that's it. Well, actually, I'll give you one more example before we go of very bad video game voice acting, which kind of embodies just the spirit of everything that we talked about. This is only about a minute long.
What do you make of these?
These? Seems to be energy resources. But I've never seen this type on Earth. I don't know where this energy came from, but you cannot let it fall into Dr. Wowie's hands. You must recover all the energy immediately, Mega Man.
But where is Dr. Wily?
That's a good question. We may be able to locate another energy emission from the radar room. When we find that meteor, we'll find Dr. Wowie.
So yes, this was a real scene from the game Mega Man 8. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much for watching Dr. Wowie, indeed.
Thank you. I'm like trying to calm down. Thank you so much, Liz. So we're gonna, so first, like, virtual claps for that amazing talk. Thank you so much. I think everyone especially got a lot out of those final examples. So thank you so much, Liz. That was great. What we're going to do is we're going to take a 10-minute break before we get to Q&A. So there's a couple of things. One, if you want to leave up that like link resource like during this break, just so students can kind of like go after those links, that would be fab. And
okay,
also for students, we're going to take our 10 minutes. Please put in questions in the Q&A. For Liz, I'll be here keeping track and we'll start that up. So it is currently, let's see, 5:53. So y'all come back at 5:05. Sorry, 6:05. 6:05, and we'll move on for them.
Okay, so I will turn off my camera, but I'm going to share the screen with the resources while you all are coming up with questions and stuff.
Cool. Awesome.
So I'll be back in 10 minutes.
Yep. See y'all soon. All right. I think we can start back up now. Thanks for those links, Liz.
Okay.
I'm sure everyone is
Okay. I I can
looking
put the
at them.
PDF up somewhere too. Can I take it out of the screen share? Is that okay?
Yes, yeah, we
Okay.
can be finished with that. Cool. So we got a good range of questions, and I am grouping them kind of in themes, but I kind of want to start out like, I feel like when it comes to your talk, like fundamentally kind of at the core, there is this tension of like, an assumption around what is good and what is bad, right? And just kind of like, as game, like from different perspectives, right? So from like the perspective of players, from the perspective of game designers, and the perspective of like critics. And so I'm kind of curious to kind of open this up with like, like, what is it about this discussion about what is good and what is bad that we're kind of getting at here? Because like, I would say like, let's say, both you and I have been involved with like games criticism and all other writing of important topics. And I can imagine, like, I can remember times where like, we'll be talking about something on Twitter, then all of a sudden we'll be hijacked by like, this new release came out. Is it good? Is it bad? And like deciding on whether something is good enough to be noteworthy and written about was like it was kind of like an overwhelming force when it came to this. So I'm kind of curious, just to kind of start us off, where does like kusoge kind of like land in this good versus bad sort of debate for you?
I mean, it completely depends on the game, but I think a lot of this is kind of that's almost not even relevant to some of this, because like a lot of these games are not games that you're necessarily going to play, or they're only things that you're going to experience through videos about. Like, very few people are ever going to play big rigs over the road racing.
Well, about 100 of them are about to.
Yeah,
so you
yeah,
just
yeah,
up this profile probably by a lot.
But I mean, there are games like Superman 64 or something that were like mass produced that a lot of people played. But I think at this point in time, there aren't a lot of like mass produced sort of, I mean, I don't know what even that is that anymore now that games are increasingly digital, but there aren't that many like mass produced games that are like that are so notably bad. Like they're more often just like kind of mediocre. There's just a higher scale of development costs to things. I mean, there are still plenty of bizarre, idiosyncratic, quote unquote bad games that are indie stuff, or just random free games on the web and all that kind of stuff. I don't even think about it in terms of like a binary. I guess to kind of hijack this question, when I'm like looking, I find this stuff inspirational, like as a design kind of idea, because like sometimes you look for this stuff and it's like, wow, that idea could have been really interesting if they implemented it in a different way, or like it just with different standards, like where I don't have to sit through and play this whole game for 20 hours or whatever. It becomes interesting as just an artifact. And even sometimes it's interesting to experience too, not to take away from some of the stuff, the quality of, and I feel like that's true with like Ed Wood or people like that. There's just very entertaining there. It's unique, and it really stands out. And it stands out from a lot of stuff that is kind of blandly mediocre. So I really think it's more about just what you're able to take from it, like, and if it's like useful to you or not. If we're talking about big budget AAA games, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's almost like separate from that discussion at least at this point. Because like, I mean, there are certainly elements in big budget AAA games, like, like that Cyberpunk 2020 or Cyberpunk, whatever the hell it's called, Cyberpunk 2077, that was like very broken, and there are all these glitch videos and funny things. Those are definitely elements of like that kind of experience that I'm talking about, but it's in pieces. It's not like a whole thing. So I don't know. I find oftentimes like the critical commentary on it kind of useless. And I think this stuff is more almost interesting in hindsight, like when you get like a little, because then a little bit more like what stands out and what is worth talking about, and you can evaluate to yourself what is worth talking about or focusing on.
Okay, I think that's fair. Would you say then that is this still a conversation about like taste, or let's say like what tastes like we have been kind of brought up to have, I guess, as opposed to like being like chosen taste, I guess. Like, because I'm kind of curious about like the kind of convention. Something that's always been interesting to me is like this idea of like alternate design histories, which I think you very explicitly talked about. And it's like there are just like timelines of design that are just gone because like kind of like taste has been decided for us in some way. So like do these like yeah, so I'm kind of, would you say that if it's not this idea about like kind of like a good versus bad sort of like dichotomy, then like where do you see conversations about taste happening and how these things kind of fit into that?
I mean, I feel like this stuff develops over time. Like I think about how I used to watch movies. I was not like a big movie person as a kid. I mostly watched like studio comedies or whatever. And if I watched a movie where I didn't really understand what was going on, I basically didn't like it and thought it was a bad movie. Like I remember watching The Shining and being like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't like this movie. And when I was like in high school, and then like I got introduced to a few like basic kind of art films or like things like Apocalypse Now or and I started like Ingmar Bergman or whatever, because I was like a film major in school, and like basic kind of 101, Citizen Kane, that kind of thing. Right. Basic 101 art films. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is what, this is, I actually really like these. This is really interesting. So, for a certain amount of time, I got obsessed with that. I got obsessed with like Andrei Tarkovsky or people who are like really technically accomplished, very refined directors or whatever. And then over time, I realized like, well, that's not most people don't have the situations where they could do that, where they're in a situation where they can produce something at a large scale and have it. Most people aren't Hideo Kojima in game
right.
terms, or, like most people don't have those kinds of resources. So how, if you're existing within those systems, how do you find your own way to like put your stamp and identity on something? And I think in a weird way, that's what people like Ed Wood are doing. And they're doing it maybe unconsciously. But it's part of it's almost part of the thing to say like, I exist and I have value in a weird way. I don't know, I think there is something kind of noble about continuing to make stuff even in the face of overwhelming odds, in the face of people saying your thing is the worst thing ever. Like I mean, and if you accomplish the worst thing ever, then that is impressive, but there's obviously something there that is making people react that way, but right. I think that is what I find interesting. And it's more about like heart and personality and just taking what you can out of something. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just draws like a different line, because like I would say just like looking at the lecture and I'm watching this chat, like I noticed that like students have been commenting and interacting with like the things that they're looking at way more than like all the maybe more conventionally good games that we've been looking at. And I think one question that I got in the Q&A was like, why are big failures so much more interesting than boring? Success is so boring. And it's just true. Like, you looked at all of those things and you couldn't help but like appreciate them for their badness, because I don't know, for me personally, I see it as an earnestness. Yeah, I guess, like the earnest. I think what you're saying, kind of like the heart kind of comes out of it because it's so bad that it can't possibly be like manufactured. Why do you think that like these like huge failures end up being more interesting as opposed to success, which technically are designed to be interesting, right? They're only supposed to be, right? They're supposed to be designed to be like compelling to us in some manner, but it seems like these accidental failures tend to capture our attention more readily.
I mean, it's the same reason that like a guy slipping on a banana peel is funny to a lot of people, or like it's misfortune. It's disaster. It's something that's not supposed to be there. I think it's why. I mean, so many of these so many of these games are part of the kind of content mill online. Like they've been reviewed by all the reviewers because they know they'll get for sure views for streaming this, because more people are going to react to, you know, some streamer or YouTuber playing through this stuff. I guess that's the kind of the cynical side of it, but I think it's also like, if we're going beyond just talking about experiences being notable for how bad they are, like I just think I don't know, I just think there's something about it that's like disarming, and it kind of gets you out of the usual like barriers that you build up, you know, to experiencing art. Like obviously if you're playing, I don't know, Super Mario Brothers 3 or Doom or something, or you know, something a little bit more that takes a civilization, or something that takes like a little bit more investment. It's just that the relationship that you build is over time, and it can be difficult to convey that. It can be more difficult to convey that stuff. So I think that's part of it. But it's also like I said, again, kind of inspirational in some ways to me, especially as games become more and more abstracted away from human beings and more the result of these like huge giant companies. You know, we don't really know the individuals behind Nintendo games, and they deliberately keep it that way, that it's deliberately a thing. And because of that, we don't know about like how it's just all a unit of Nintendo. And because of that, we don't really get a sense of all the kind of personal struggles of the people who work there. And that's a common story in the game industry. And I think that's kind of a shame. But yeah, that kind of stuff gives more of an insight into the people and the personalities. And also, you know, things can just become blandly good when they become so over canonized or whatever. Like I really like Doom, but it's hard to talk about why Doom is good in some sense because it's already been talked about a billion times, you know? So I think that's part of it. People just get tired of talking about the same things.
Right. Like when something works, it just seems to work. And I guess it is kind of true that is more interesting to talk through critique, because like there's always more to go through.
There's
especially
also
when things are bad.
Yeah, there's also sometimes a fine line between good and bad. Like it's a very
yeah.
like it's a finer line than you think. So you can kind of see. So an interesting way to think about like something that's really canonized is like, what are all the ways that this could have gone bad?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, there are some that you can't. Also, first of all, we had a lot of God hand stands in the chat.
I didn't know that. I didn't know how many people knew about that game.
So it seems like we have quite a number that you know, are here to rep it. But I do think there is this interesting, I think it's interesting you brought that up, because of some games that are, I think, supposed to be bad in some way, but end up being good. So I think about like, well, Deadly Premonition 1 is like, it is like this idea of like, it's a cult classic that people don't like, but is good. I don't know, you know, it just,
well, I think a lot of people do like that game.
Yeah. I also think of things like Shenmue and like other type, like the kind of Shenmue likes that kind of came off from it, like of all these like odd, especially of like certain eras of game, like Dreamcast era games or anything involving the Dreamcast, right? Kind of just like, oh, like that, there's just like an aesthetic to like failure, you know, that just seems to kind of like persist in an interesting way. But I kind of want to bring something that I thought is interesting that you've been bringing up, which is this interesting connection between these interesting failures and labor practices that has been kind of like this reoccurring theme. And it's kind of hard to ignore that, given just like, well, the persistent news of like horrible labor abuses that we have in the video game industry. We actually just had a little bit of a town hall here at Game Center talking about, you know, about like various workplace like abuse that's been going on, and ideas of like what is labor, like the future of labor in games. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because of like all these like I think there's kind of a dichotomy here. First, we heard like horrible labor practices that came out like with like ET, right? So like maybe that could be somewhat of a explanation for it. But also like the boring successes also have horrifying, you know, like workplace, you know, stuff there too. And like, I feel like every once in a while I see like a headline in games of like, this is a great game, but was it worth the cost? Right. Kind of like that sort of framing where people are kind of like, you know, putting like, what is the idea of like a cost for a game? So I feel like a couple of questions that I got is this idea of like, is something like kusoge even like possible anymore, given like this certain like kind of like labor climate, or even desirable? Like, where do you see either like, is traditions or legacy living on, or is it just kind of like a different mood now?
I mean, there's so many different kinds of development. Like, I mean, if we're talking about like AAA games, they're not really going to develop deliberately bad games, but they might have what you might think of as engineered jank to them. Like something like
Right.
Fortnite is something that has engineered jank to it. It's
Mhm.
designed to look kind of weird or out of place so that streamers will play it, so that, you know, engagement. And it's a little, and yeah, it's cynical, but that is like increasingly a lot of games are engineered to have like elements of that.
Mhm.
But no, I mean, I think it's like there are plenty of budget, just random projects, and I see random stuff on Steam pop up all the time, just
Mhm.
terrible, bizarre games pop up all the time. So those games definitely exist. It's just
Mhm.
like, you know, smaller indie studios or one person, or, you know, and maybe some of those will rise above the crop and, you know, be known or be more notable years down the line. But it's hard to know about that stuff. But like, I mean, yeah, when we're talking about like major, but there's increasingly like few major like flagship kind of games at all to begin with. Like
Mhm.
great games are increasingly becoming more like indie development because they're the models of like labor for developing bigger and bigger games are becoming more kind of unsustainable. So, and
Mhm.
they're just, I don't know. But I think this stuff continues to exist. It's just like, it's important to think about that, like, a development studio in the 90s or the 80s might be one developer, which we think of as an indie developer, or it might
Mhm.
be a developer of like 5 to 10 people, which we would call an indie studio. We call like
Mhm.
things with like 50 employees indie studios now. And
Right.
like most games were made with less people than that up until a certain point. This is a pretty recent phenomena. So
Right.
maybe it's kind of coming back to some of that stuff as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I also think, are you familiar with like glorious train wrecks and like other sort
Mhm,
of like
mhm.
intentional, like how do they fit into this puzzle? Like, and also the idea of like intentionally being bad, like I feel like I have a couple of questions, like, and I'm wondering if people want to make their own kusoge. I think this is what's going on. Like, is it still considered kusoge if it's intentionally, like if you do it
I'm
intentionally
well,
bad?
Takeshi's challenge we just talked about was
True, you're right.
intentionally bad, or
Oh, I love
Desert
it.
Bus.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, it like the reason why it becomes known that way is it becomes played by like a huge amount of people, and a lot of these were published on consoles, and it was more unusual at the time. There are a lot of deliberately bad games now, all the time. um, some of it comes also, some of it, I think some of it comes as a result from ambition. Like you can tell that there's a certain amount of ambition to the vision, because if it's
Mhm.
just somebody's personal project, you know, that's kind of bad, then whatever. But a lot of times, like, you can tell that there's ambition there, but it, you know, went wrong. And ambitious failures are always interesting. So I think that is an important component of that, because something like Takeshi's challenge is very ambitious in what it requires you to do, to the point where it
Right.
becomes notable and like stands out on its
Mhm.
own,
Mhm.
because it's going for such a specific thing. um but yeah, I mean, you can always, I mean, it's hard to know how intentional and unintentional, like, you know, a lot of times it's developers who don't have time, or they don't, you know, have resources, but maybe unintentionally they were just like doing things intuitively, and you know, maybe they just were trying to do something like that. I mean, we
Mhm.
don't really know, you know,
Right.
intentionality is hard to like gauge. So um
Right.
but yeah, no, I mean, I think it can be intentionally designed, but I think a lot of these games have been embraced over time because of certain subcultures and forums and communities. And, you know, I mean, there are examples of games like that that kind of introduce intention, have very seemingly bad, janky mechanics, but actually are very intentionally designed, like a game called Cruelty Squad, which came out this year, which is this first-person shooter, like immersive sim game with these very weird color barf aesthetics, and it looks like a game that is poorly designed, but it is actually, very good for what it is. But I think that is a game that's kind of inspired by and using that elements to make something that is still weird and out there, but very singular and like knows what it's doing. So I like to think of that as the end result, is that this stuff can be redeemed by us like reclaiming it and making it into something that is really like knows what it is, and is really going for a specific thing.
Right. I also just think about kind of just like general, like other arts that in which like sometimes things are intentionally shitty, not because like being crappy is an intentional aesthetic, but like there's just other things that are more important. Like for instance, like if we think like just general, like punk music or something, right? Or just like, just things in which people are kind of like, I just need to strum like this simple chord for this thing that I want to do. And yeah, it might be crap, but like people will enjoy it because like the message or other things are more important than let's say like particular things that we are accustomed to being good. And I just think about that of just like a whole bunch of like, like DIY game makers in the past decade who like never took a game design class, will never code, will do all these things, but will make games. And in a way will somehow still have their work kind of like judged based off of conventional ideas of like, good or bad.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've struggled with, like, making some stuff that's intended to be experimental and not like explicitly stating that, and have people be like, whoa, this is terrible. You have no idea what you're doing. And it's like, no, I mean, that's what I intended to do. I know, but it's hard to convey that to some people. And my only like hope is that people figure out over time that there is intentionality in people's standards and like expectations change. Cause I do think those things do change like over time. What I was going to say, a musical example I was thinking of is, there was this website, I think it was called the American Song Poem Anthology. And what you could do in like the 70s is you could pay like $200 and you could send a poem off to this like cheap like studio, and they would make a song out of the poem that you wrote. And there's like anthologies of it online, and they are so bad.
Oh no.
And it's super cheesy, like middle of the road, generic sounding stuff made on a budget, but like it's the bizarreness of some of these poems, because they had to make these because they were getting paid for them. And that's an example of like some kind of like cult art, or it's just a fascinating story too. It's like there's it kind of gives you an insight into the process of making this stuff as well. I don't know.
No, I love that, and I'm so glad I now know that existed. I would like to kind of like circle back to this idea of like sort of like the difference between like what we saw of like, let's say Takeshi's Challenge or Castle, and then something like contemporary like Dark Souls, like what people call like masocore or whatever. And this like what to you is like the discerning difference? Like you brought up like polish, like this sort of like polish, and like the way that it's like it's interesting. There's these different kinds of like, there's like an acceptable difficulty and an unacceptable difficulty, which I find kind of interesting, because like I think about times in which like controversies in games where when like players or studios were like, oh, we'll lower the difficulty of things, or we'll have an easy mode or a story mode, that's kind of seen as like sacrilegious in some idea. And then you get things like Dark Souls, which are like, oh, this is like a difficult that I like. But then there's a lot of other things that seem difficult but are bad difficult. Like where do we land on that? Like what is going on there when we have like apparently like something like Dark Souls is okay, but like Takeshi's like Challenger Castle is bad?
Yeah, I can read a bit from this article that I quoted from earlier, because it talks about this a little bit. It says,
Mhm.
in a way, Takeshi Kitano is a brilliant game designer. Looking at his work from the point of view of Jesse Schell's Art of Game Design, which I guess is a game design book, Takeshi inverts many of the lenses of good game design. Instead of using them to create a pleasurable experience, the inversion offers a terrible, frustrating one. And then it talks more about specific things that games use to kind of, okay, I'll just read it. It says, for instance, other games use the lens of resonance to tap into the power of a positive theme that players can relate to, whereas Takeshi built his off of themes of guilt, frustration, and despair. And yeah, it talks about other games use the lens of flow to ensure that players have a clear goal and understand how to get closer to that goal. Takeshi, on the other hand, gives you clear goals: save the company, save your job, and find a buried treasure. But some of these goals are red herrings, and there's no clear information or play choices to help you progress towards the goal. Additionally, there's very little feedback to let you know what you're doing, and that feedback does not, and the feedback that does exist is negative. So a lot of games use specific like design kind of techniques. A game like Dark Souls trains you to play it by, you know, different kind of like, you know, the enemies it introduces you to, the way that you progress through the environment, and it frames the environment in a very particular way so that you experience things in a particular way. And there's options and there's different ways that you can approach like in the context of this, it's like the difficulty is more a result of just time and learning to play the game, and learning its specific rules, than it is really a result of like and there's, you know, degree of execution, but it's something that definitely gets easier the more you do it. Whereas something like this, there's no skill that is really being built up. It is just a result of kind of arbitrary decisions. Now, you could engineer this feeling specifically and have some way to hint at players that this game is trying to make you do things that are counterintuitive, and that could be an interesting choice. But that's why I think some of these games are more interesting to think about than they are to play, because games that like Takeshi's challenge that are, you know, intentionally trolling you, not providing you information to proceed, can sometimes get lumped in with ones that are cryptic or whatever. But once you kind of learn the language of the game, you start to understand how to play it. And I think those two things should be separated out. And it's not saying that one is worth talking about or another. And sometimes the dividing line is hazy, but I think that's where people usually draw the line. As far as like the difficulty in Dark Souls debate, I think that has more to do with like accessibility and how many people, you know, they want to play it as like this mass popular game. I think that's like less relevant when you're talking about if you're going for a specific niche audience, unless you don't think that the difficulty is necessarily an essential part of the experience. Maybe the story is a big part, so maybe you want to make some things easier. I don't know. That's a personal decision. I feel like people want to be they want to be prescriptive and say that one thing should always be this way or should be another way. And I just don't agree with that, especially when we're talking about like indie or like games that are made by one person or whatever. I'm not expecting them to have an accessibility mode. I'm sorry. Like, you know, but if it's like a mass release title, yeah, you have the resource to do that, you know? So I don't know. It really just depends. But yeah, I think that's where I do the dividing line. Does the game kind of teach you or give you clues on how to play it versus does it not? Yeah.
Right. Oh my gosh, I was gonna follow that up with something very specific, and I literally just forgot it the moment I thought it. What was I going to say? Oh, so this kind of reminds me of like this idea of this kind of like dissonance when like people want to make games that are maybe not about fun or about topics that are not like, or narratives or feelings or whatever that are not necessarily associated with fun, but like our understanding of how to design things is based around fun, and how those two things kind of tend to like come at each other. Like for instance, in my work, people are often asking me, you know, to consult on games that are about like serious topics, but they want to make it fun and like can't really square away how that doesn't make sense. So like in this kind of like effort to like diversify and expand the kind of like emotions that can be expressed, you know, through this medium, I kind of see like what you're talking, you know, Elisa, the idea of Takeshi's challenge of like, it seems like that sort of design should be re-examined to be like, well, maybe sometimes we do need frustration or sometimes we do need all these other things because like, do you want to make a fun game about like hating your life? You know, like it's just kind of like, you know, or do you want to make a fun game about every single topic? Like, is it possible to, you know, have some other, because like I get the reason that like fun often means that like games are accessible or engaging, but it still seems to kind of be off for like the kinds of different things that people want to do. So I guess this is my roundabout way, is kusoge kind of like a tactic into these other emotions that we can't seem to like design under a fun perspective? Like, how is it that we access all these different emotions?
Well, yeah, I think it's a weird way. Yeah, it maybe is a little bit of a shortcut. I mean, it's like horror movies. Horror games and horror movies. I think of as like, there are a lot of things that we think of as being like sordid or that are just bad and that you wouldn't do that are acceptable in the lens of like a horror game and a horror movie to a lot of people because of this idea that, you know, that the idea is that you're supposed to be scared or uncomfortable or whatever. And that's like an accepted category, but a lot of other stuff that's more ambiguous is not. I think that could change, but I mean, I honestly think a lot of this has to do with the way that the industry is established, and like games weren't necessarily always this way, and what was considered fun is inherently subjective. I know a lot of people want to define it. I think it is impossible to define fun, and I don't think that like, I mean, when I do like critiques in class, I try to convey, you know, I mean, I try not to just say this isn't fun because that could mean like 100 different things, but like I try to convey like why I think maybe this isn't working. But like, it's just like, I don't even like, I don't know, like it is ridiculous to me when people try to make games about serious issues and they want like, it's kind of like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down kind of. And like, I get it. There are ways that you can do that. But like at some level you have to reckon with the fact that like conveying those things requires like you to take a chance creatively and not just make Mario. Like even like Nintendo makes chances, you know, takes chances creatively, but like there's this expectation that all games have to fit to the standards of like a Nintendo game or a AAA game. And that's just not true. That is not true, but a lot of people will accept that idea. But on those standards, if you were doing a game about a serious topic and you're trying to make it as fun as Mario, you will fail. Like you will fail. And people might say like, oh, it's not as fun as Mario, but like, sorry, that's like, and I think it just comes down to game literacy, like people understanding the kind of experience that, you know, they expect and being able to actually want to invest time in something. Maybe that comes the difference between like I talked about Japanese kusoge and maybe like, you know, bad games in the US where we had the angry video game nerd who I like perfectly fine, but a lot of his videos like gave a lot of random games the reputation that they're these horrible bad games, and some of them just some of them weren't bad games just at all, but some of them just had like weird or unintentional or, you know, bizarre design decisions that were actually pretty interesting, and just like he was just like looking at it through the wrong lens. So part of it is just like learning how to approach it. But if you're talking about like making it and people have this expectation that things have to fit into a certain, I think that needs to just be blown up. I don't know. There needs to be a reckoning with this stuff, because I still think that a lot of audience tastes in games are very conservative, but there's a lot of very interesting and bizarre stuff out there, and those things have not caught up to each other. And I think maybe in 20 years they will. Maybe we will have people looking for the Ed Woods and whatever. I mean, maybe there are to some extent now, but you know, maybe that'll become a more accepted mainstream thing. But I think it's still a long way, and there's a lot of tension between those things. And like, yeah, I just think there are a lot of things that people have to reckon with, and like you have to make sacrifices and you have to like make decisions and commit to them. And because oftentimes someone might not like the uncomfortableness of something that you introduce, but it might make it a better experience that is longer lasting, and it isn't just this flash in the pan that goes away and everyone was like, oh, that was kind of mediocre. So people need to think about the long term and not just the short term.
Right. I agree. I think there's something to discomfort or how much we avoid it in game design that I think is quite compelling here. Just the last question. So speaking of like, 20 years in the future, what do you think people in the future, let's say in 20 years, would think is kusoge that's coming out now? And what sort of lessons can we learn from those? Like, what will be looked upon as shit games from right now, do you think?
I mean, probably a lot of just like stuff that you and I or anyone in chat have never heard of. I think that's probably part of it. Maybe elements of like of big AAA games, maybe not the whole game, but like elements of it. Like, I mean, people might look at those Elder Scrolls games or like, those Bethesda Fallout. People might look at some of those AAA games and see them as kind of embarrassing and funny. Because honestly, like even some of the ones from like the 2008, 2007, like a game like Oblivion, it has gone from it is starting to go almost into charmingly dated territory.
Right.
In the same way that like a lot of people consider something like Mario 64 kusoge or something. I don't
Yes,
agree with that. Yeah,
we had someone ask.
I don't agree with that because I think Mario 64 is a very well designed game that just has a different style of presentation, and is much different from like, it looks much different from like what a modern Mario game would look like. I think that is really a lot of it, but one has it's more cryptic than a lot of Mario 64 is my favorite Mario game, but I think that maybe some of the tropes that we think of as like, at the time everyone was like, oh, this is badass, this is, state of the art or whatever. And we look at it and we're like, what was anybody thinking? But maybe it goes back into the territory of like, oh, this is actually kind of goofy, like, maybe unintentionally. So I think that's part of it. And the other part of it might be just random cult games and weird ephemera and just random budget Steam releases and random free games and stuff that might gain a cult following. And I really hope for that to exist because there are so many of those games out there. I try to follow that stuff and it is overwhelming.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. This was great. I can already tell that a lot of students like really enjoyed this and that we are going to get a lot of engaged conversation over big rigs, which I am really excited that students are playing. So yeah, everyone please give another round of applause to Liz. Thanks for the talk. We're going to wrap up here now, and tomorrow I will send everyone out a recording, including you, Liz, so you all can look at it. But other than that, thanks everyone. And I think this is a wrap.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.